and for the poignancy of your testimony. The next person to testify is Sondra Anton. She's a JD candidate at Harvard Law School, where she's co-president of Advocates for Human Rights and a student attorney in the International Human Rights Clinic. She specializes in the field of international human rights law, international criminal law, with a focus on justice and accountability for victims of mass atrocities. For the past year and a half, Ms. Anton has led a project team within the International Human Rights Clinic that works with a wide network of partners seeking accountability for violations of international law committed against the Sri Lankan Tamil community during the country's civil war. Ms. Anton's father is Tamil and was forcibly displaced. Ms. Anton, you have the floor. Ms. Anton, are you muted? Are you with us?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Chairman McGovern, Chairman Smith, Congresswoman Ross, and esteemed members of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission for the opportunity to testify today. Today, my remarks will center on international justice efforts to hold the Sri Lankan state security forces accountable for mass atrocity crimes. I will also identify how the United States can bolster these accountability efforts, particularly for violations committed against the Tamil civilian population that occurred during the final stages of the country's internal armed conflict in 2009. Finally, I would like to center the importance of having survivor communities in these accountability efforts. In addition to being Tamil, I also am the descendant of an Ashkenazi Jewish mother whose relatives escaped Jewish pogroms in Eastern Europe. Indeed, I am the product of two lineages of survivors that, at different periods in history, sought refuge and relief in the United States to escape this relentless ethnic persecution and violence. With that in mind, in the context of today's hearing, I want to emphasize how important it is that the United States support work by Tamils for Tamils. I will ask that my written testimony today is submitted for the record. What happened in Sri Lanka in 2009 and the complete impunity to date that has remained for these crimes in the nearly 13 years since marks one of the worst failures to uphold the promise of never again in modern history. Much of the bloodshed during this time occurred in government-established no-fire zones, where at one point over 300,000 Tamil civilians were trapped between the warring parties, a situation that a 2011 UN panel of experts has described as reminiscent of hell. Tens of thousands of these civilians died in the war's final 8 months alone, a staggering death toll that came primarily as a result of military shelling. The past 12 years in Sri Lanka have shown that domestic-led accountability efforts at this point in time are simply not an option. The unwillingness and inability of successive Sri Lankan governments to acknowledge, let alone independently investigate and prosecute those responsible for human rights abuses committed against the Tamil community in 2009 is clear. The return to power of the Rajapaksa family has only reaffirmed that impunity persists. The failure of Sri Lankan institutions to investigate and prosecute has been recognized in no uncertain terms by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights in her most recent report in January 2021 on Sri Lanka. For this reason, International accountability efforts must step in to fill the gap and pursue the prosecution of war crimes and crimes against humanity for the 2009 era violations. The US government has a critical role to play here in bringing high-level perpetrators to justice in both international and domestic forums outside of Sri Lanka. The US government should first support the collection, verification, analysis, and sharing of evidence, including survivor testimony. In March 2021, the UN Human Rights Council resolution on Sri Lanka recognized, quote, the importance of preserving and analyzing evidence, and decided to strengthen in this regard the capacity of the Office of the High Commissioner to collect, consolidate, analyze, and preserve information and evidence. The US government should fully support this call to expand independent investigative efforts, as it has supported similar efforts in Syria or Myanmar to collect and preserve evidence. The Human Rights Council also called on governments to quote, support relevant judicial and other proceedings, including in member states with competent jurisdiction. With this in mind, US government agencies should coordinate and facilitate information sharing and cooperation with foreign officials' investigations and prosecutions of war crimes under their domestic universal jurisdiction frameworks. And finally, there should be dedicated support for Tamil survivor communities to center them in accountability efforts. As those with the most at stake in terms of this period in time, survivor communities have relevant experiences, evidence, and expertise that must be integrated into a holistic approach to achieving accountability and justice. Overall, the United States and the international community cannot undo what happened in 2009, but we can make sure that calls for justice from victims do not go ignored. Thank you for your time today. And I would also just like to clarify, even though my father had escaped Sri Lanka and ethnic persecution there, he was not forcibly displaced, but instead was one of the lucky ones to get to leave on his own.
Well, thank you so